Hello and welcome to the Security Collective podcast. I'm your host, Claire Pales, and today we welcome back Dan Maslin. We first met Dan way back in episode 14. Dan, it's great to have you back on the podcast today.
Hi, Claire. It's been a couple of years, so thank you again.
Pleasure. It's good to have you. And this season, we're asking guests what's changed since they were last with me in the studio, so to speak. So for you, what would be the three major changes you've seen in cyber since you were last on the podcast way back in episode 14?
Yes, I think there was already focus on cybersecurity back then. It was a couple of years ago, but there's definitely a lot more focus now, and it's coming from a lot of different angles. So there's a lot more in the media around cybersecurity. We've got a lot more focus from boards and governance groups on cybersecurity. Government's talking about cybersecurity a lot more, as well as regulators. So there's definitely a lot more focus on cybersecurity from all aspects. Also seeing collaboration, so a lot more collaboration within industries and more broadly, I guess, across the whole spectrum of the cybersecurity profession, and real recognition that we're all broadly facing the same problems. So I think there's a bit of recognition that together we're stronger, and people are happy to collaborate a lot more, whether that's informally or in more formalized groups. I think as well, the impact of incidents is much more significant and frequent as well. So, for example, ransomware events, most days you'd see something in the news around an organisation that's impacted by ransomware, and those incidents, they're much more frequent, and they're much more significant in terms of impact. I think probably the other thing that's front of mind for me is around it's a lot harder these days to find and retain talent at all levels of experience. So I think related to that as well, compared to a couple of years ago, salaries are steadily rising, as well as probably stress and burnout levels at all levels of experience as well.
Yeah, I have definitely seen salaries skyrocketing and the number of organisations just grappling to get really great staff into roles and the right people into the right roles as well. I mean, it's, as you said, it's that rising recognition of cyber, and it's in the press, and more companies are experiencing it. And with some of the leaders that I speak to, what they're most concerned about is that uptick in ransomware and what we're seeing in phishing as well. How do you think this growing threat should be addressed when it comes to things like security awareness and influence? Because as an organisation, everybody panics and goes out and hires more cybersecurity staff, or tries to. Is there more that an organisation can be doing around awareness and influence so that there's more going on across the employee community and not just the cyber team?
Yeah, I think looking at some of the data, particularly, so let's say with ransomware, in many cases, vast majority, it's back to hygiene practices. So it's around, patching vulnerabilities, ensuring there's not misconfigurations, and they're often the major entry points for ransomware. So when we're looking at awareness and influence, I think there is still a need for a lot of that to focus on the tech teams and making sure that the skills are there and the knowledge is there to ensure that, to put simply, patches are being applied and configurations are hardened. And I think, we really need to focus around setting expectations for remediation and supporting those teams to make sure that there are no blockers. So supporting the IT teams and supporting the technical teams, setting expectations and ensuring that we can have that basic level of hygiene. And I think, a CISO role, for example, plays a key part in that, in terms of clearing the road. So clearing those roadblocks, and making sure that the IT teams can do those jobs, and there's no excuse for not applying a patch, or no excuse for having a poor configuration of a web server or whatever it is. So I think, that there is awareness, but I think from a general staff awareness perspective, we're probably doing okay in most organisations. There's obviously the outliers, but most organisations would have a fairly decent awareness program these days. One of the next steps on the awareness journey, though, I think as boards become more aware of cybersecurity, they become more comfortable with metrics and questioning the data that they're given over the next few years. I think they're probably going to start probing and expecting management to be a bit more harsh on non-compliance with that data. So, for example, if we have people in the organisation that are constantly failing phishing simulations, and we've got really bad pass rates in phishing simulations, maybe they're going to expect management to do more about it. So what's the repercussions for them? Are they going to cut them off from using IT? They're a risk to the organisation. And so I think from the top, there will be expectations that management will be doing a lot more to protect the environment. So I guess, the analogy there might be that people need to have a driver's license to drive on the road. They need to take a test. They need to show they understand the risks and the rules on the road. And I think there's going to be that expectations from governance groups that they are providing a level of protection for the environment against misuse or people that haven't passed a test, that don't understand the risks and the rules of using that environment.
It's a really interesting topic because there's always been talk about how there's not necessarily enough consequence when it comes to the people who might cause a cybersecurity incident in an organisation. And most people are not malicious in clicking on that link or downloading that attachment or, putting in that USB stick. It's not, they're just doing their jobs. But for the people who are blatantly going around process or, using shadow IT or those types of things, there are security leaders and non-security leaders that feel that the repercussions should be greater and that people should be made an example of. I don't know, have you got an opinion?
Yeah, I think it's a balancing act of supporting people. So we've got to play a role in educating people to be able to identify the risks and know what's the right thing to do. Very similar again to driving a car. You've got a driving instructor that teaches you how to be safe on the road. You then pass a test and you get your license. So we've got a responsibility there to try and influence people to make sure they are less of a risk from a technology user perspective. But then I think at some point there does need to be consequences, particularly for those that blatantly ignore the rules and the rules of the road. That's what happens if you ignore the rules of the organisation's IT and the lanes that we expect you to stay in. Then I think there does need to be consequences, whether that's cutting them off or whether there's some sort of other reprimand. But I think the expectation will be there that something's enforced and those risky users are dealt with accordingly.
I'm interested to know whether or not you think different organisations need different types of security policies, structures, frameworks. And last time we met, you were actually just finishing up in your role at RACV, and now you're well and truly settled into Monash a couple of years later. What's different about managing security teams in different sectors? Because obviously RACV is a very different industry sector to what education and academia is. Is there a difference in how you secure those types of organisations and it's a mindset shift as a CISO?
With any change between industry, there's a lot of transferable skills as a CISO. Let's say 80% is transferable, but the rest is really around business and understanding the strategy, how they operate, who the key stakeholders are. And in a large university, it's probably a 6-month process to really understand what the organisation does and what the priorities are. And that's going to be the same whatever organisation you're moving into. So I think most skills are transferable. I guess between the different industries, previously I was in a membership and insurance industry. Now, obviously, in a university, it is more collaborative. And not to say that insurance or membership areas aren't collaborative, but within Australia, there's roughly 40 universities and a number of industry groups as well. So it's a lot more organised. The collaboration is a lot more organised. So it's easy for me to meet other CISOs because there's regular groups that are organised, and the relationships between those organisations have been in place for many years, many decades probably. So it is a lot more organised, the collaboration, and people are comfortable in sharing. Probably the biggest difference in the industry and how they approach everything from risk to frameworks, policies, procedures is that a university, it's a lot more of a balancing act. So a university by nature is open and collaborative, shares research and shares education. That's fundamental to a university. But we also do a lot of research that is sensitive. So defence research, medical research. To operate, we need technology these days. Obviously, with the last couple of years, almost everything's remote, including research, including teaching, but also exams and all that sort of stuff. And so we need to balance that openness, collaboration with the risk to technology, and that we simply can't operate without that technology now. So it is a lot more of a balancing act. I think a lot of other industries are less open and less collaborative by nature.
And where you are now, you've got a much bigger team than previously. And from a structure perspective, you recently created a new deputy CISO role. Tell me about how a role like that's come about and what you are hoping to achieve by building that out into your model.
For a number of reasons here, but I think to start with, I think it's probably in the best interest of the organisation to have that continuity. And what I mean by that is having a succession plan for the CISO, whether it's me or somebody else. And, you know, it's not like I'm going to leave anytime soon. I love working at Monash, but from their perspective, they need continuity. So, whether I'm hit by a bus, I win Tats Lotto, or I just want to take a long holiday, whatever the analogy is, there's going to be someone that's there and is kind of up to speed with what the CISO is doing. They can step in, and these days everyone wants a bit of the CISO's time, and it's important. You've got a lot of stakeholders, a lot of executive and governance groups that you report to, and they really want a lot of the CISO's time, and you can't always give it to them. So it's important to have someone that's clearly a senior leader within the team to go and have discussions with them, have relationships with stakeholders, have some delegated accountability and decision-making power, and give that role, whether it's the deputy, assistant, whatever the actual title is, give them that ability to own and run with that and make the decisions. There's that component. There's a development path as well. So I think for an aspiring CISO, clearly the person in the role now and people in the role in future, probably their next step is going to be the CISO, whether it's in this organisation or elsewhere. So I think it's an important part of someone's development and being able to ease them into the role and understand really what a CISO does. It's something I do for all of my direct reports. So have I guess a bit of a succession plan for each of them. So I think it's a really mature discussion to have that I may not be here forever. And so I think in the best interest of the organisation, we need someone that's sort of warm and ready to go into the role, whether it's for the long term or the short term, whether they're filling in for a holiday or some period of extended leave. I was having a think about this the other day, and I've seen. I mentioned it earlier. A lot of burnout in the last 2 or 3 years, particularly from CISOs. And some really, really good CISOs that you think would really be able to deal with the day-to-day stuff. And there's been a lot of pressure and coming from all angles. And I guess the CISO role is quite lonely and sort of being at the top of the team. You're the only one that has the wide view of everything that's happening. I think a lot of other parts of the team can be siloed and you don't, security operations may not be across what's happening in the risk and compliance area, for example. But as a CISO, you're sitting across it all, and it's quite a broad portfolio. So I think if you have someone you can lean on and share some of that workload, I think that's quite important as well. And reflecting on some of those peers that I've seen that have heading down the burnout path, I think in their cases they may have been able to, if they had someone there to assist them and a solid deputy to lean on, potentially it could have been avoided, or they could have shared the workload a lot more. So I think there's that aspect to it as well.
Obviously, if every organisation gets a deputy, it's going to put me as an interim CISO out of a job. So I don't know that I recommend every business does that. But I am interested in the background of the type of people that you think might be a good deputy CISO, or is it not about that, and is it more about where that person's coming from in terms of their leadership skills, the culture fit, do they need a technical background, or do they need a GRC background? What for you is the right set of skills for a deputy to sort of sit by your side and learn the ropes and be able to then step in for you at any given time?
I'd probably say there's three key things actually around people leadership. So it's very important to have someone that's got the right people leadership skills and be able to create a positive culture in the team. I think that's probably more important than anything. Someone that has a bit of a vision in terms of not just dealing with day-to-day activities, but someone that can say, we are here today and this is where we want to be in 2 or 3 years' time, and be able to sort of move that into a plan. And someone that's able to have good stakeholder relationships. So they're going to represent the team, they're going to represent the CISO, so be able to really have mature discussions with key stakeholders across the organisation. So it doesn't need to be overly technical, could be really technical. I think that's depends on the background. You're always going to get people with a varied background, but I think you're sort of looking for more of those attributes around leadership, relationships, and vision.
And I think on your point just around burnout, Sam McLeod is on this season. She's come back again to talk about her burnout in the industry, which actually occurred long before COVID and before everybody was sort of under this additional pressure. And we've had obviously Graham Cowan on the podcast before talking about Are You OK Day and just burnout across the community, not just in cyber, but certainly the idea that you have somebody there sharing that load just makes a lot of sense. And I hope for lots of organisations they have an opportunity to do that, because I think many organisations can't get necessarily, as we were talking about earlier, enough security staff. And so the pressure on the ones that are there can be incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's, again, if you've got it structured right, where they're delegated and they're clearly they've got a clear role, a senior role in the team. If you're dealing with multiple priorities at the same time, you can delegate big pieces of work, and they can be accountable for that and help you deal with the amount of work that you've got on your plate.
I want to finish up by just quickly talking about the Security of Critical Infrastructure Bill, because it now lists universities as part of critical infrastructure, and whereas before it was very much focused on, I guess, more of a utility group of industries. What does this mean for universities, and how can universities approach cyber in the coming years? Is this going to change things? And obviously the bill got through the lower house just a couple of weeks ago. So what's going to shift for universities in general, do you think?
Yeah, it's quite topical, and again, this is something we talk about a lot in the industry groups that we have. So it is quite collaborative, and it is a big topic. And just for context, for those that aren't familiar with universities, so you might wonder why we come under critical infrastructure. It's quite obvious why the energy sector or defence sector would come under critical infrastructure. But universities are, they're typically thought as education providers, but a lot of them are heavy into research. So it depends on the institutes, and some are really research heavy and some aren't so much. But a lot of the big universities in Australia do actually do a lot of research that is of national significance. So it might be COVID research, or it might be defence research. There are a lot of organisations, a lot of entities that are doing defence research within universities. So it's important that the right steps are taken to protect that research. So I think at a high level, universities, that they need to be organised and structured in how they approach protecting their environment. So for those that don't have a forward-looking plan and to mitigate the risk, and most do, that would need to be developed. But I think probably the biggest change that's going to come for universities, and it's happening in our industry and it's happening in other industry as well, is around the culture change. So where cyber risk continues to move outside of the IT department. So in a university case around critical infrastructure, it's going to mean that asset owners, which are in our case actual researchers or research platform owners, they're actually going to be having government mandated security obligations that they need to meet. So again, it's that shifting of accountabilities outside of the IT department to distributed parts of the organisation. So it's a big culture change. Again, it's not just specific to universities, but yeah, it's happening in our industry and it's happening in other industry as well. So I think it'll drive a lot of that change and make people accountable for security of certain assets that previously they may not have considered so critical. But through the lens of critical infrastructure and through national significance, through that lens, it is quite important to protect those assets.
And I love the idea that you led with culture and not with, well, it just means we're going to have to lock things down more and put more tech in. It really is about how people behave with data, and how that accountability piece is incredibly important. And obviously now with legislation coming, it just puts it through a whole new lens.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does go back to what we were talking about earlier, and that's around collaboration, and universities need to be open, collaborate, sharing of ideas, sharing of information. But now there just are some reasonably sensible obligations on those assets for protection now as well.
Dan, it's been awesome to have you back. Thank you so much for returning to the Security Collective today. And we'll pop some notes in the show notes about a few of the things that we talked about. But for now, thank you, and hopefully we see you again.
Thanks for having me, Claire.
Thanks so much for joining me today. If you want more information on any of our guests, head to thesecuritycollective.com/podcast. This podcast is produced by East Coast Studio. I'm Claire Pales, and I look forward to seeing you next week.